A Path Beyond Desire Part 1: The Awakening of a Question. Long before doctrines were written down, before temples were raised from stone and ritual was wrapped in ceremony, there lived a quiet question in the human heart. It was a question older than kings and older than cities. It asked, again and again, why existence carried suffering within it, and whether there was a way beyond that suffering. In ancient India, at a time when sacred hymns were no longer accepted without doubt, many minds began to turn inward. The authority of tradition was questioned, not out of rebellion, but out of exhaustion. Life was marked by birth, illness, aging, and death, and no chant or sacrifice seemed able to soften these truths. It was in this atmosphere of searching that a young prince came into the world. According to ancient stories, before his human birth, this being dwelled in a heavenly realm, a place of clarity and calm. Yet even there, insight arose. Existence in comfort alone was not enough. To understand suffering, one must encounter it directly. And so, he chose to be born among humans. He entered the world in a place surrounded by mountains, near what is now the foothills of the Himalayas. His family belonged to a ruling clan, and his father was a king. At birth, the child was given a name that meant the one who achieves his purpose. From the beginning, expectations followed him like a shadow. His upbringing was carefully designed to protect him from pain. He was raised within palace walls, surrounded by beauty, education, and pleasure. He learned the arts of leadership, discipline, and refinement. He married young, had a child, and lived a life that appeared complete by every worldly measure. Yet something remained untouched. As years passed, the sheltered world began to crack. One day, the prince encountered realities that had been carefully hidden from him. He saw illness. He saw old age. He saw death. And finally, he saw a figure who had renounced worldly life in search of peace. These encounters were not merely sights, they were revelations. They struck the prince with a force deeper than fear. They revealed a truth no palace could erase: life, in its ordinary course, is bound to suffering. At the age of 29, he left everything behind. This departure was not an escape but a deliberate step into uncertainty. He left his family, his power, and his future as a ruler. His goal was not comfort, nor recognition, but understanding. He sought freedom from the endless cycle of birth and death, and a way to end the pain that seemed woven into existence itself. What followed was not immediate enlightenment. He wandered, studied, practiced severe asceticism, and pushed the limits of the body. He learned from teachers, followed strict disciplines, and nearly destroyed himself in the process. But starvation and extreme denial brought no clarity. They only replaced one form of suffering with another. It was then that a crucial realization emerged. Suffering does not end through excess, nor through self-destruction. Truth lies between. This insight became the foundation of a path that would later be described as a middle way. A way that rejects both blind indulgence and ruthless denial. A way grounded not in ritual authority, but in direct understanding. When awakening finally came, it was not accompanied by thunder or spectacle. It came quietly, under a tree, through deep observation of the mind. In that moment, existence revealed itself not as chaos, but as a pattern governed by causes and conditions. Birth is suffering. Aging is suffering. Illness is suffering. Death is suffering. To be separated from what one loves is suffering. To be bound to what one dislikes is suffering. To desire what cannot be obtained is suffering. Yet suffering, he saw, is not random. It arises from craving, from grasping, from the endless thirst for permanence in a world that cannot provide it. And if suffering has a cause, then it also has an end. This realization did not remain private. It demanded to be shared. The awakened one began to speak, not as a god, but as a guide. His words were simple, direct, and accessible. He did not appeal to revelation or divine command. He appealed to experience. He taught that liberation does not come from believing, but from seeing. Thus began a teaching that would spread across lands and centuries, changing form while preserving its core. A teaching that asked humans not to worship suffering away, but to understand it fully, until it loosened its grip, and fell away on its own. Part 2: The Nature of Suffering. After his awakening, the teacher did not claim to have discovered something new. Instead, he spoke as if he had simply uncovered what had always been present, hidden beneath habit and illusion. His words did not aim to impress, but to clarify. Again and again, he returned to one central observation: suffering is not an accident of life, it is a condition shaped by the mind. He taught that suffering arises not merely from pain itself, but from attachment to what is impermanent. Humans cling to youth as age approaches, to health as illness waits, to life as death remains inevitable. This clinging creates tension, resistance, and fear. And from that resistance, suffering grows. Craving takes many forms. It is the desire for pleasure, the hunger for recognition, the longing for permanence. It is also the quiet insistence that things should be different from what they are. Even the wish to escape suffering can become another form of craving when it turns into desperation. Yet craving does not stand alone. It is supported by ignorance, not ignorance as lack of intelligence, but as misunderstanding. A misunderstanding of reality's true nature. People assume that what changes can be held, that what fades can be secured, and that the self is a fixed entity moving unchanged through time. The teaching challenged these assumptions gently, but firmly. Nothing remains the same. Nothing exists independently. Nothing possesses a permanent core. What we call the self is a flow of sensations, perceptions, thoughts, and reactions, constantly arising and dissolving. To cling to this flow as if it were solid is like trying to grasp a river with closed hands. From this misunderstanding arise fear and conflict. From fear comes grasping. From grasping comes suffering. But there is a path out. The teacher spoke of a way that leads neither into indulgence nor into denial. A path grounded in ethical living, mental clarity, and insight. It is not a belief system, but a practice. Not a doctrine to memorize, but a way of seeing to cultivate. This path unfolds step by step, each aspect supporting the others. Right understanding means seeing reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. It begins with recognizing suffering, its causes, its ending, and the way leading to that ending. Right intention follows naturally. When understanding deepens, intentions soften. Greed gives way to generosity. Ill will dissolves into compassion. Harmful impulses lose their grip. Right speech, right action, and right livelihood shape daily life. They are not moral commands imposed from outside, but expressions of clarity. When one sees that harm returns as suffering, restraint becomes natural rather than forced. Right effort, right awareness, and right concentration cultivate the mind. They train attention to remain present, steady, and clear. Through this training, the mind becomes less reactive and more spacious. Gradually, insight deepens. One begins to see thoughts arise and pass without clinging to them. Emotions lose their absolute authority. Pain is felt, but resistance to pain diminishes. Pleasure is enjoyed, but not grasped. This is not indifference. It is balance. In this balanced awareness, a profound freedom becomes possible. Not freedom from life's conditions, but freedom within them. Freedom from compulsive reaction. Freedom from the endless need to defend an imagined self. The end of suffering is described not as annihilation, but as release. Release from craving. Release from fear. Release from the illusion of permanence. This state is not a place, nor a reward. It is a way of being. Silent, clear, and unburdened. Those who heard these teachings were not asked to accept them on faith. They were encouraged to test them, to observe their own experience, and to see for themselves whether suffering lessened as understanding grew. And many did. Over time, communities formed. The teaching spread from villages to kingdoms. It crossed languages, cultures, and continents. Yet at its core, it remained simple: see clearly, live gently, and let go. Part 3: The Middle Way. As the teaching spread, one idea remained central and unchanging: liberation is not found at the extremes. The awakened one spoke often of balance, not as compromise, but as clarity. Life collapses when pulled too tightly in either direction. On one side lies indulgence. The endless pursuit of pleasure, comfort, and distraction. It promises satisfaction but delivers restlessness. Each pleasure fades, demanding another. The mind becomes dependent, never fulfilled. On the other side lies denial. Harsh discipline, self-punishment, and rejection of the body. This path promises purity but breeds rigidity. It replaces craving with pride and replaces desire with control. Neither path leads to freedom. The middle way is not weakness. It is precision. It requires attention, honesty, and patience. It asks the practitioner to meet experience directly, without exaggeration or avoidance. In this way, daily life becomes the field of practice. Eating is done with awareness, not excess. Work is done with care, not obsession. Relationships are lived with compassion, not possession. Nothing is rejected, yet nothing is clung to. This approach transformed spiritual life. No longer confined to forests or extreme renunciation, insight became accessible to ordinary people. Farmers, merchants, rulers, and wanderers alike found meaning in this path. The teaching did not deny the world. It redefined one's relationship to it. At the heart of this redefinition lay a radical insight: there is no eternal, unchanging self behind experience. What we call I is a process, not a thing. A pattern of sensations, thoughts, and reactions arising moment by moment. This idea unsettled many. People feared that without a permanent self, life would lose meaning. But the teaching offered a different view. Meaning does not come from permanence. It comes from presence. When the illusion of a fixed self loosens, compassion naturally expands. If there is no rigid boundary between self and other, then harming another is harming oneself. Helping another is not sacrifice, it is alignment with reality. From this understanding arose deep compassion. The awakened one emphasized kindness not as sentiment, but as wisdom. Anger, he taught, burns the one who holds it first. Hatred poisons the mind long before it reaches its target. Forgiveness, then, is not moral superiority. It is freedom. He spoke gently of patience, humility, and attention. These were not virtues to display, but tools to dissolve suffering. Meditation became a central practice, not to escape the world, but to see it clearly. Sitting quietly, observing breath and sensation, practitioners learned to watch the mind without interference. Thoughts arose. Thoughts passed. Silence deepened. In this silence, insight matured. One sees that all things arise due to causes. Nothing exists alone. Every action leaves an imprint. Every intention shapes the future. This understanding gave rise to a profound sense of responsibility, not imposed from outside, but emerging naturally. Life became a field of consequences, not judgment. The teaching did not promise salvation through belief. It offered transformation through understanding. Those who walked the path were encouraged to question, to doubt, and to verify through experience. Truth, it was said, does not fear examination. And so the path continued to unfold, not as a rigid system, but as a living tradition. It adapted to cultures, languages, and times, yet retained its quiet core: awareness, compassion, and release. Part 4: Lives Before and Lives Beyond. As the teaching deepened, it began to speak not only of this life, but of life as a continuing stream. Existence was no longer seen as a single event between birth and death, but as a long unfolding shaped by intention and action. According to this view, every being moves through countless forms. Birth follows death, and death follows birth, not as punishment or reward imposed from outside, but as a natural consequence of causes set in motion. Actions leave traces. Intentions shape direction. Nothing is lost. This cycle of repeated becoming is not described as a blessing. It is described as burdened. Each return carries with it aging, illness, separation, and loss. The goal, therefore, is not to perfect rebirth, but to understand the forces that drive it, until they fall silent. Stories were told to make these ideas visible. In these stories, the awakened one appears not only as a human teacher, but as animals, rulers, wanderers, and servants. Again and again, the same theme unfolds: self-sacrifice, patience, and compassion. In each life, the same intention ripens further. A noble elephant gives up its own body without anger. A deer offers itself to protect its herd. A monkey becomes a bridge so others may cross safely. A rabbit enters fire rather than turn away from suffering. These are not legends meant to glorify pain. They are mirrors, reflecting a truth about transformation. Liberation grows from letting go of self-centered fear. Through these stories, listeners were invited to see themselves differently. Not as isolated individuals, but as participants in a vast, interconnected movement of life. What one does matters. What one intends matters even more. Yet the teaching was careful. It did not encourage obsession with past lives or speculation about future ones. Such curiosity, it warned, can become another distraction. The focus remained here, now, in this moment. Understanding is cultivated where life is actually lived. Freedom is not postponed. The stories served another purpose as well. They soften complex ideas, allowing ordinary people to approach profound truths without philosophy. A child could understand generosity through a tale of an animal. A ruler could see restraint through the fall of a cruel king. Wisdom became accessible. Over time, these stories were gathered, retold, and shaped by many cultures. Their language changed. Their symbols shifted. But their core remained intact. Suffering diminishes when compassion grows, and liberation becomes possible when clinging ends. Alongside these stories grew a deeper reflection on selfhood. If there is no permanent self, then what moves from life to life? The answer offered was subtle. Not a soul, not a fixed identity, but a continuity of causes. Like a flame lighting another flame, something passes on, yet nothing identical remains. Responsibility continues, without a permanent owner. This understanding dissolved both fear and pride. Fear, because death was no longer absolute annihilation. Pride, because no eternal essence could be claimed as mine. Between these two dissolutions, humility arose. Life was no longer about securing identity. It became about refining intention. Each moment offered a choice, to strengthen craving, or to weaken it. To act from fear, or from clarity. And slowly, for those who practiced, the weight of becoming began to lift. Part 5: The Meaning of Release. Among all the words used to describe the end of suffering, none has been more misunderstood than the word often translated as final peace. Many imagine it as disappearance, as a blank void, or as an escape from existence itself. But this understanding misses the heart of the teaching. Release is not destruction. It is unbinding. The awakened one spoke of it as the extinguishing of a fire. But what is extinguished is not life. It is craving. It is the flame of grasping that burns without rest. When fuel is no longer added, the fire does not go somewhere else. It simply ceases. In the same way, suffering ends not by force, but by understanding. When craving dissolves, fear dissolves with it. When fear dissolves, conflict fades. What remains is not emptiness in the sense of nothingness, but openness. A clarity unclouded by compulsion. This state cannot be fully described. Language reaches its limits here. Words depend on contrast, on form and distinction. Release lies beyond comparison. For this reason, it is often described negatively, not this, not that, because any positive description risks distortion. Yet those who approach it speak of profound peace. Not the peace of sleep. Not the peace of escape. But the peace of no longer being pushed or pulled by desire. The teaching emphasized that this state is not reserved for death. It is not something that begins only when the body ends. One may touch it while alive, in moments of deep insight and freedom. Such a person still eats, walks, speaks, and acts. But the weight of identity no longer dominates experience. Praise does not inflate. Blame does not wound. Pleasure is enjoyed without clinging. Pain is met without resistance. Life continues, but suffering does not rule it. This freedom does not make one distant or cold. On the contrary, compassion deepens. When the need to defend oneself disappears, attention naturally turns outward. Kindness becomes spontaneous, not calculated. The awakened one warned against turning this freedom into a concept to chase. Desire for liberation can become another chain. Instead, the path invites patience. Understanding ripens in its own time. Those who asked, "What happens after death?" were often met with silence or redirection. Not because the question was forbidden, but because it distracted from what truly mattered. The end of suffering is realized through practice, not speculation. One must walk the path. And walking the path means returning, again and again, to the present moment. Observing the body. Observing the mind. Seeing how craving arises, how it tightens, how it fades when not fed. In this simple observation lies great power. Gradually, the practitioner sees that suffering is not imposed by the world, but constructed moment by moment. And what is constructed can be deconstructed. This realization is not dramatic. It unfolds quietly. Like dawn, it arrives without announcement. And when it is fully realized, there is nothing to claim, nothing to defend, nothing to fear. Only clarity remains. Part 6: The Path Spreads. After the awakening and the first teachings, the path did not remain the experience of a single individual. It began to move outward, carried by voices, memory, and lived example. Those who listened were not asked to abandon their lives, but to understand them more deeply. Communities formed naturally. Some chose to leave household life behind, dedicating themselves fully to practice. Others remained within families, trades, and responsibilities, applying the same principles in ordinary conditions. Both were seen as valid. What mattered was not the form of life, but the clarity of intention. These communities were simple at first. Teachings were shared orally. Words were remembered, repeated, and shaped by use. There was no urgency to write them down. What mattered was living insight, not preservation of texts. Over time, however, distance and diversity brought change. As the teaching traveled across regions, different understandings emerged. Some emphasized discipline and personal liberation. Others emphasized compassion and collective awakening. Neither was seen as false. Each reflected a different response to the same insight. Gradually, two broad approaches took shape. One approach focused on individual release. It emphasized careful discipline, deep meditation, and personal responsibility. Liberation was understood as something each person must realize for themselves, through effort and insight. The other approach expanded the horizon. It taught that awakening is not complete if others remain bound. Compassion became central. The ideal practitioner postponed final release, choosing instead to remain engaged with the world until all beings could be freed from suffering. This was not a disagreement about truth, but about emphasis. Both approaches shared the same foundations: suffering, its cause, its ending, and the path leading beyond it. They differed in how that path was walked and for whom. As centuries passed, these approaches developed their own languages, symbols, and practices. New texts were composed. Stories grew richer. Rituals appeared, not as necessities, but as supports for those who needed form. Yet the heart of the teaching remained unchanged. Do not cling. Do not hate. See clearly. Act gently. In some cultures, the teaching merged with local traditions. In others, it stood apart. Kings adopted it. Merchants practiced it quietly. Monks carried it across mountains and deserts. It crossed borders without conquest. It spread without force. This quiet movement reshaped entire regions. Art, ethics, and philosophy absorbed its influence. Images appeared, not to be worshipped as gods, but to remind the mind of clarity and compassion. Still, the teacher's original caution echoed: forms are tools, not truths. When clung to, they become obstacles. When used lightly, they support understanding. The path was never meant to become rigid. Those who forgot this turned practice into habit, habit into rule, and rule into identity. Where this happened, the teaching lost its freshness. Where attention returned to direct experience, it revived itself naturally. Thus, generation after generation, the path renewed itself, not through authority, but through insight rediscovered. Part 7: The Quiet Nature of Wisdom. Wisdom, as described in this teaching, is not the accumulation of information. It is not the ability to recite doctrines or explain complex ideas. True wisdom is experiential. It grows from seeing things as they are, without distortion. The awakened one often remains silent when questioned about ultimate reality. This silence was not avoidance. It was precision. Some truths lose their clarity the moment they are forced into words. Wisdom does not shout. It does not argue. It does not seek validation. It watches. The mind, when untrained, moves constantly. It clings to memories, anticipates the future, and resists the present. In this movement, clarity is lost. Wisdom begins when attention settles, when the mind learns to remain with what is happening now. This settling is not dullness. It is alert stillness. Through careful observation, one begins to notice patterns. How thoughts arise from contact. How emotions follow interpretation. How suffering intensifies when resistance appears. And how it softens when resistance fades. This observation sharpens insight. One sees that pleasure and pain are not enemies or allies. They are events. Temporary, conditioned, and impersonal. When seen clearly, they no longer dominate behavior. Wisdom recognizes impermanence not as an idea, but as a lived reality. Every sensation fades. Every emotion shifts. Every identity changes. Holding on to any of these creates tension. Letting go is not loss. It is alignment. As insight deepens, certainty dissolves. The need to be right weakens. Dogmatism gives way to curiosity. The wise mind remains flexible, open, and responsive. This flexibility allows compassion to flow naturally. When one sees how ignorance creates suffering, judgment softens. Harshness loses its appeal. Understanding replaces blame. The teaching emphasized that wisdom and compassion cannot be separated. Wisdom without compassion becomes cold. Compassion without wisdom becomes blind. Together, they form balance. This balance expresses itself quietly in daily life. In speech that avoids harm. In actions that consider consequence. In restraint that arises from clarity, not fear. Those who cultivated this wisdom did not withdraw from the world. They engaged with it differently. Less reactive. More present. More free. Wisdom did not promise control. It offered freedom from the need to control. This freedom brought a lightness to being. Life was no longer a problem to be solved, but a process to be understood. Joy appeared not as excitement, but as ease. Even sorrow was transformed. It was felt fully, yet without despair. Pain passed without leaving bitterness behind. Such wisdom could not be claimed as identity. The moment one says, I am wise, wisdom has already slipped away. It remains only in attention, humility, and openness. Thus, the path returned again to simplicity. Breathe. Observe. Let go. Part 8: The Illusion of Self. One of the most unsettling insights offered by this teaching concerns the sense of self. From early childhood, a feeling of I forms, solid, continuous, unquestioned. It appears to stand behind thoughts, emotions, and actions as their owner. Yet when examined closely, this self cannot be found. What appears instead is a collection of processes. Sensations arise in the body. Perceptions label them. Thoughts comment. Emotions respond. Memory strings moments together, creating the impression of continuity. From this weaving, the sense of a permanent self emerges. But it is a construction. The teaching did not deny experience. It denied the existence of an unchanging core behind experience. There is feeling, but no fixed feeler. Thinking, but no permanent thinker. Acting, but no eternal actor. This insight often provokes fear. Without a solid self, people worry that meaning will collapse, that responsibility will vanish, or that life will become empty. Yet the teaching pointed in the opposite direction. When the illusion of self softens, life becomes more vivid, not less. Responsibility deepens, because actions are seen clearly as causes. Compassion expands, because the boundary between me and other loosens. Anxiety eases, because there is no fixed identity to protect. The self, it was taught, is like a knot tied in moving water. The water flows on, but the knot creates tension. When the knot loosens, nothing is lost. Flow continues freely. This understanding does not come through belief. It arises through observation. In meditation, practitioners watch thoughts appear without invitation and disappear without command. They see emotions change without effort. They notice how the sense of I strengthens when threatened and weakens when attention is calm. Gradually, certainty erodes. One no longer insists on being someone. One simply responds to what is present. Life becomes less about maintaining an image and more about meeting reality. This does not erase personality. Habits remain. Preferences continue. But they are no longer mistaken for identity. They are patterns, not essence. With this shift, suffering loses one of its strongest supports. Much pain arises from defending a self-image, being right, being valued, being secure. When the image is seen as provisional, conflict softens. Criticism no longer wounds deeply. Praise no longer intoxicates. Comparison loses its grip. Freedom appears quietly, as relief. The teaching did not force this insight. It respected the mind's pace. Pushing too hard can harden fear. Understanding must mature gently, supported by stability and kindness. Thus, the path balanced insight with care. One learns to see clearly without becoming detached from humanity. Warmth and clarity grow together. When the illusion of self loosens, life does not disappear. It opens. Part 9: Action and Responsibility. In this teaching, ethics is not imposed from above. There is no command demanding obedience, no external judge keeping score. Instead, ethical behavior is presented as a natural consequence of understanding. When one sees clearly, one acts carefully. Good and bad are not framed as absolute moral categories, but as movements that either deepen suffering or ease it. Actions rooted in greed, hatred, and confusion tighten the knot of existence. Actions rooted in generosity, kindness, and clarity loosen it. This is not punishment. It is cause and effect. Every intention leaves a trace. Even when unseen, it shapes the direction of the mind. Over time, these traces accumulate, forming habits, tendencies, and character. In this way, the future is quietly constructed by the present. Ethical conduct, then, is not about perfection. It is about alignment. Speech becomes mindful because careless words cause harm. Silence becomes valuable because not every thought needs expression. Honesty becomes natural because deception fragments the mind. Action follows the same principle. Violence is avoided not because it is forbidden, but because it deepens suffering for all involved. Restraint arises not from fear, but from understanding consequence. Livelihood is also addressed. How one earns a living shapes the mind daily. Work that exploits, deceives, or harms strengthens inner conflict. Work that supports life, fairness, and clarity strengthens peace. None of this requires withdrawal from society. It requires attention within it. Mistakes are expected. The path does not demand purity. It invites learning. When harm is done, acknowledgement restores balance. Guilt is not cultivated. Responsibility is. This approach removes the need for judgment. Others are not divided into good and evil. They are seen as acting from varying degrees of understanding and confusion. This vision softens anger and opens space for compassion. Justice, in this view, is not revenge. It is restoration. The aim is to reduce suffering, not to satisfy resentment. As understanding deepens, ethical behavior becomes effortless. One does not need rules to avoid fire once its heat is known. In the same way, harmful actions lose their appeal when their cost is clearly seen. This does not make life rigid or joyless. On the contrary, freedom grows. Trust in oneself deepens. Inner conflict lessens. Ethics becomes expression, not obligation. Part 10. Facing Death. Death was never treated as a taboo in this teaching. It was not hidden behind euphemisms, nor pushed aside as an uncomfortable topic. Instead, it was brought into clear view, examined calmly, and integrated into understanding. Fear of death, it was said, arises not from death itself, but from attachment to the body, attachment to identity, attachment to unfinished desire. When these attachments loosen, fear loses its grip. Death is not an enemy. It is a certainty. By contemplating death, one does not become morbid. One becomes honest. Life is seen more clearly when its limits are acknowledged. Time gains value. Attention sharpens. Trivial concerns fall away. The teaching encouraged regular reflection on impermanence. Not to depress the mind, but to free it. When one truly sees that everything will pass, clinging weakens naturally. This reflection transforms how one lives. Words are chosen more carefully. Conflicts lose urgency. Kindness becomes immediate. Life is no longer postponed. The body is understood as fragile and temporary. It is cared for, not worshipped. Aging is not seen as failure, but as process. Illness is met with patience rather than resentment. Death, when it comes, is approached with awareness. For those who practice deeply, death was described not as a shock, but as a transition. The body dissolves. Sensation fades. What continues is not a self, but a momentum shaped by intention. This understanding removed both terror and fantasy. There was no promise of eternal reward, no threat of eternal punishment. Only continuity shaped by cause. Those who clung tightly to life suffered most at its end. Those who learned to let go gradually found peace even in their final moments. The teaching did not romanticize death. Grief was acknowledged. Loss was honored. Tears were not forbidden. But despair was softened by understanding. Mourning became an expression of love, not confusion. In this way, death became a teacher. It reminded practitioners of what mattered and what did not. It revealed the urgency of clarity. One who remembers death lives fully. Part 11: Living Together. Although the path is walked individually, it was never meant to be traveled alone. From the earliest days, the teaching recognized the importance of community. Not as authority, but as support. Not as control, but as shared clarity. Human beings are shaped by their surroundings. The people one listens to, the habits one absorbs, the values one normalizes, all quietly influence the mind. For this reason, practicing together was seen as protection against confusion and forgetfulness. Community offered rhythm. Daily routines provided structure. Shared silence deepened attention. Mutual reflection prevented self-deception. When one person strayed into excess or rigidity, others gently brought balance back. Discipline within community was not punishment. It was care. Rules were simple and practical. They existed not to limit freedom, but to preserve it. Like riverbanks guiding water, they prevented attention from spilling into chaos. Simplicity was emphasized. Possessions were kept few. Needs were reduced. This reduction was not poverty, but clarity. When life becomes uncomplicated, the mind follows. Hierarchy existed only where necessary, and even then, authority was grounded in example rather than command. Those who guided others were expected to embody patience, restraint, and humility. Learning flowed in both directions. Teachers reminded students of the path. Students reminded teachers of sincerity. No one was placed beyond questioning. Insight remained the final reference. Community life also revealed the mind's habits clearly. Irritation arose. Attachment formed. Pride appeared. Instead of being hidden, these reactions became objects of practice. Relationship itself became a mirror. In solitude, one may imagine freedom. In community, one tests it. Compassion was not abstract. It was practiced daily, through listening, through restraint, through forgiveness. Conflicts were addressed directly, not avoided. Resolution mattered more than victory. This approach created resilience. Communities endured not because they were perfect, but because they adapted. When forms became rigid, renewal followed. When attention faded, practice revived it. Over time, these communities carried the teaching across vast distances. They preserved not only words, but ways of living. Their strength lay not in uniformity, but in shared intention. Together, they demonstrated a quiet truth: awakening is supported by connection, not isolation. Part 12. Forms and Symbols. As the teaching spread across regions and centuries, new forms began to appear. Images, gestures, chants, and rituals emerged, not as part of the original insight, but as responses to human need. The mind, it was understood, often requires form to approach what is formless. Symbols point where words cannot. An image of calm reminds the restless mind of stillness. A repeated phrase steadies attention. A simple ritual marks intention and creates pause. Used wisely, these forms support practice. But the teaching always carried a warning. Forms are tools, not truths. When symbols are mistaken for reality, they lose their value. When rituals are performed without awareness, they become empty habits. When images are worshipped as ends rather than reminders, confusion replaces clarity. The awakened one emphasized direct experience above all else. No gesture could replace understanding. No chant could substitute for insight. No symbol could carry liberation on its own. Yet he did not reject form entirely. He understood that human beings learn through repetition, rhythm, and meaning. For some, silence opens the door. For others, structure does. The danger lies not in form, but in attachment to it. A ritual performed with awareness becomes meditation. A symbol approached with humility becomes guidance. A tradition held lightly becomes support. Trouble arises when form becomes identity. When one says, "This is who I am," rather than, "This is what I use." At that point, the tool hardens into a barrier. Different cultures shaped the teaching differently. Some emphasized simplicity and restraint. Others developed rich symbolic worlds. Some leaned toward philosophy. Others toward devotion. None of these expressions were inherently wrong. The question was always the same: does this reduce suffering or increase it? When forms encouraged kindness, clarity, and humility, they aligned with the path. When they fed pride, fear, or division, they drifted away from it. The teaching remained flexible. It trusted awareness more than structure. It trusted insight more than authority. Those who remembered this used forms as ladders, climbing them when helpful, letting them go when no longer needed. Those who forgot clung to the ladder and mistook it for the destination. The path itself remained unchanged. Quiet. Direct. Accessible. See clearly. Let go. Be kind. Part 13: Forgetting and Remembering. No teaching remains untouched by time. As generations pass, insight can fade into habit, and clarity can harden into form. This teaching was no exception. Wherever it traveled, it faced the same challenge: how to remain alive rather than preserved. When understanding is fresh, practice is simple. When understanding fades, complexity grows. Rules multiply. Explanations lengthen. Symbols accumulate. What was once direct becomes layered. Not because the teaching demands it, but because the mind seeks certainty where clarity has weakened. This is how forgetting begins. Practice turns into routine. Routine turns into identity. Identity turns into defense. At this point, the teaching no longer liberates. It organizes. It comforts. It divides. People argue over interpretations rather than examine experience. Loyalty replaces inquiry. Belief replaces seeing. Yet forgetting is never final. Again and again, individuals arise who return to the core. They strip away excess. They sit quietly. They look directly. And in doing so, they rediscover what was never lost. Renewal does not come from reforming institutions. It comes from restoring attention. Such renewals have occurred many times. In different lands. In different languages. Often quietly, without announcement. A teacher emphasizes simplicity. A practitioner rediscovers stillness. A community returns to balance. Each renewal looks different. Some emphasize meditation. Others emphasize compassion. Others emphasize wisdom. But all return to the same foundation: direct understanding of suffering and its end. This cycle, forgetting and remembering, is natural. It reflects the human condition itself. Minds drift. Minds return. What matters is not preventing drift, but recognizing it. The teaching never claimed permanence for its forms. It trusted insight to renew itself whenever needed. Those who truly understood did not lament change. They adapted without losing essence. They spoke in new ways without betraying old truths. They knew that truth does not belong to any era. When the teaching weakened, suffering increased. When it revived, suffering eased. This simple measure remained the ultimate test. Does this practice soften the heart? Does it clarify the mind? Does it reduce harm? If the answer was yes, the teaching was alive. If the answer was no, it had become something else. And so, across centuries, the path endured, not as a fixed structure, but as a living movement of understanding, forgetting, and remembering. Part 14: A Teaching for This Time. The world has changed beyond recognition, yet the human mind remains deeply familiar. Cities have grown, technology has accelerated life, and information flows without pause. Still, beneath these changes, the same patterns endure: craving, fear, comparison, and the quiet longing for peace. Modern life magnifies distraction. Attention is pulled in countless directions. Silence has become rare. Restlessness is normalized. In such conditions, suffering often appears not as dramatic pain, but as chronic unease, a sense of never arriving. This teaching speaks directly to that condition. It does not reject modern life. It does not demand withdrawal or rejection of progress. Instead, it invites awareness within movement. It asks not for escape, but for presence. Even brief moments of attention can interrupt habit. Even small acts of kindness can soften isolation. Even a single breath, fully felt, can restore balance. The teaching reminds modern individuals that fulfillment cannot be consumed. No amount of stimulation can satisfy a mind trained to grasp. Peace arises not from accumulation, but from release. This insight feels radical in a culture built on desire. Yet it is deeply practical. One need not change everything. One need only notice. Notice how craving tightens the body. Notice how comparison drains joy. Notice how stillness heals. Technology itself becomes neutral under this view. It is neither enemy nor savior. Used unconsciously, it amplifies restlessness. Used with awareness, it becomes a tool rather than a master. The teaching also addresses loneliness, a quiet epidemic of modern life. When identity is built on achievement and image, connection becomes fragile. Fear of vulnerability isolates. Yet when self-centered fixation loosens, genuine connection becomes possible. Listening deepens. Empathy grows. Presence replaces performance. In a world obsessed with speed, this teaching offers patience. In a culture driven by noise, it offers silence. In a time of fragmentation, it offers integration. Not by imposing meaning, but by revealing it. Meaning emerges naturally when attention settles. When one is no longer running from discomfort or chasing fulfillment, life reveals its texture. Ordinary moments regain depth. Simplicity becomes enough. The teaching does not promise happiness in the conventional sense. It offers freedom from the need to be happy. And in that freedom, a quieter joy often appears. This joy does not depend on circumstance. It arises from alignment. Thus, even now, even here, the path remains open. Not as a relic of the past, but as a living response to present suffering. Part 15. The Silent Legacy. This teaching never promised miracles. It did not offer instant relief or dramatic transformation. Its influence has always been subtle, almost easy to miss. And yet, wherever it has taken root, something has quietly shifted. It does not announce itself. It leaves no demand to believe. It asks only to be lived. Its legacy is not measured in monuments or numbers, but in softened hearts and clarified minds. In moments when anger pauses before acting. In moments when fear is met with awareness instead of escape. In moments when kindness arises without calculation. Such moments rarely make history. They happen in private. In ordinary lives. In choices that seem small, but accumulate over time. A word not spoken. A reaction released. An attention returned to the present. This is how the teaching works. It does not replace life. It reveals it. Those who walk this path do not become separate from the world. They become more fully part of it, less defended, less divided, more responsive. Their presence carries a quiet steadiness that others feel, even if they cannot name it. There is no final identity to claim. No title to protect. No certainty to impose. The teaching dissolves the need to be someone special. In doing so, it frees something essential. Freedom here does not mean control over circumstances. It means freedom from compulsion. Freedom from the endless demand that life be other than it is. Freedom from the weight of becoming. This freedom expresses itself as simplicity. Life is lived one moment at a time. Attention returns again and again. Letting go becomes familiar. Nothing is forced. Nothing is rushed. The teaching does not compete with other paths. It does not claim exclusivity. Wherever understanding reduces suffering, it recognizes kinship. Wherever compassion deepens, it feels at home. It knows that truth is larger than any form. And so, it leaves behind no final word. Only an invitation. To pause. To observe. To let go. To see for oneself whether suffering can end, not through belief, but through understanding. The rest is silence.